Hello, everyone, and welcome to our KaiNexus Training Team Office Hours webinar, episode 25. My name is Adam Darnell, and I'm the Training and Enablement Manager here at KaiNexus, and I'm joined by my partner in crime, Product Manager Ryan Rippey.
Wait a second, you're not Banna.
That's right. Well, some might say I'm better, but
Oh, I like it.
We also have a very special guest today, KaiNexus Senior Advisor, Mark Graban. Mark, thank you for being with us here today.
Yeah, sure thing. I'm also confused that Ben is not here, but happy to be here. Well, actually, welcome aboard, Adam. Happy to be, I guess, like a visiting professor for office hours or something.
I see what you did there, Mark.
There you go. Yep. Well, sorry to cause any confusion, but for those of you new to our webinar series, welcome aboard. The way this works, we plan to basically nerd out for the next 30 to 45 minutes or so on a KaiNexus topic that we'll share with you all in just a bit. The purpose of these webinars is for us to review the hottest topics and the latest and greatest features suggested by you, our customers. Before I reveal our topic for today, let's go over some of the housekeeping items. So the first being, this webinar is being recorded, so we're going to go ahead and send out the slides and recording to everyone after the webinar. Also, if you do have any questions during the webinar, please feel free to type those in the chat box. We'll do our best to answer those in real time, as well as at the very end of the webinar if there's some time left over. All right, so let's take a look at our webinar topic for today. Drum roll, please.
Oh, we're bringing back Banna's drum
We're bringing
roll.
back the drum roll. I figure.
It used to drive me crazy.
Control charts.
So, Adam, control charts have always existed in KaiNexus, but actually in our recent 2.4.2 release, we enhanced the feature functionality as well as brought them to the forefront of KaiNexus by actually giving them their own chart type in the system now. Mark, I believe you know a little bit about control charts, may have even written a book about them. Am I accurate there?
Yes, I have, and that's why I'm here. I'm really excited about the functionality in KaiNexus, and I want to give just a bit of what might be a refresher course or an intro to the topic. I've done a couple of full hour-long KaiNexus webinars on the subject of control charts and some of the methods in my book, Measures of Success. So if you want to check out those webinars in the KaiNexus webinar library, you can do that. You can also let us know if you have trouble finding them. So I guess, should I go ahead and we'll go ahead and take a look at control charts and some of the other ways that organizations display and track metrics?
Yeah, go ahead, Mark. If you want to take over, I think the next slide is going to give us kind of an agenda outline that you can take us through what we're going to talk about today.
Great. So I'm going to compare and contrast a little bit some of these other methods that organizations use and illustrate these for you. Something called bowling charts. Don't worry, you don't have to turn in your shoes and some questionable shoes to use these charts, but these are something that people use. There's run charts, and then something I think is a better alternative called control charts. So we'll take a look at those three ways of visualizing data, and then we'll also talk briefly about how do we use a control chart. What are signals that tell us that our system and our metric has changed in a meaningful way. And then I'm going to hand things back over to Adam and Ryan to show you the functionality in KaiNexus and how to build a control chart. We'll have an opportunity to talk about how to use control charts. So again, I think kind of a common alternative that I've seen in different organizations is sometimes called a bowling chart. It's basically like taking an Excel spreadsheet, a list of numbers, and posting it in a dashboard or on a bulletin board, or it's basically, looks like if you were to go bowling and have your score tracked, even though, when you're bowling, the score always goes up, but people call it a bowling chart. I guess in a way, it just sort of looks like that. But when we list a table of numbers, like it's really unfair to expect people to detect trends or meaningful variation in a list of numbers like this. We see like, oh, well, February 18 is lower than December 18th, so I think we're improving. Like it's hard to tell. Sometimes people color code bowling charts, and we may be comparing each number to a goal. So in this example here, lower is better. So anything that is, so looking at just the list of numbers didn't give us that context. 117 is actually worse than a March 18 number of 89. So we're looking to say, well, the metric had been green and now it's red in the last month. Do we react? Do we do a root cause analysis? Do we try to explain why it's gone from green to red? Maybe not. So if it's difficult for people to look at lists of numbers, with or without color coding, a better alternative, a better way of visualizing data is a run chart. And in this example, we see more data points than were displayed in the bowling chart. And we can look at the run chart and see, well, what does this tell us? Is the number trending in a meaningful way? Is it just fluctuating around an average? Is it, we can guess. I think a run chart tells us more than the bowling chart. We might look and say, well, it doesn't really look like performance has changed that much going back a couple of years. It's up, it's down, it's kind of a roller coaster of performance. And again, I think people tend to overreact to every up and down in a metric. They try to explain every up and down. They do a root cause analysis, looking for a root cause that might literally not be there if a metric is just fluctuating around an average. So if we want to visualize data this way and not guess if it's going up, down, what's happening over time, we can use a control chart. Now we're going to show the KaiNexus version of it. What I've drawn here, is just generated in a spreadsheet. We can see we've got the blue data points that show how this is behaving over time. The goal, that green, red boundary is shown here as a dashed blue line. But then a control chart really adds three very helpful lines. The green line there is the average, which now helps set context that, well, we have some data points that are above average and some that are below. We can't have every data point be better than average. And then the red lines are calculated, and there's different methods for doing this. I'm a fan in particular of what's either called an XMR chart or a control chart for individuals, or it's also sometimes called a process behavior chart. But the concept is the same regardless of what control chart method we use. We calculate what we call a lower and upper limit. These are the red lines on the chart. And let's actually just take, here's a little bit bigger version of that chart. So if we have what we call a predictable metric driven by a predictable, stable system over time, we'd expect to see all of those data points fluctuating within the red lines. You can think of those as guardrails or boundaries. And moving forward, we might predict that performance is going to continue falling within that range. But what jumps out very obviously, I think, on a control chart is this data point here, the one and only data point that's above the upper limit. So this is one indication of what we call a signal. If we were to try to ask about any data point, what changed, what went wrong, what happened, what was different, questions like that, this month here, which I think is July 2017, is the one month where that question is a good use of time. There is a root cause of that data point. Now, whatever happened was apparently a temporary effect, whether it was a difference that just went away or if the organization fixed and eliminated that problem. But we look ahead going forward, we don't see any future evidence of signals or changes in performance. So beyond looking for that data point outside the limits, this is a different chart here that illustrates three main rules for finding signals, and these are pretty visual. So first off, again, as we see here, is any single data point that's outside the lower and upper limits. The second rule, which is pretty easy to see from a visual perspective, is 8 or more consecutive data points that are all on the same side of the average. This is statistically very unlikely to be randomly occurring. It's a good indication that performance has shifted. And again, it would be a good time to ask why. What happened? What's the root cause of that change? And then the third rule here is looking for 3 consecutive or 3 out of 4 data points that are closer to the same limit than they are to the average. So these are 3 rules that we use with control charts that help us avoid having to guess when the system has changed or not. And the final thing I want to show, and then we'll go take a look at this in KaiNexus. I think would be sorely disappointed with me if I didn't practice what I preach about using control charts for things I'm involved in. So one of the things I manage is our other webinar series where people give presentations about topics related to continuous improvement. So one metric we track is the number of registrations for each of those webinars. And this is how it's visualized in KaiNexus. We have an average, we have an upper limit. In this case, over this time frame, the baseline period that I used for calculating the limits, the lower limit was negative. So we can kind of ignore that for a minute. But you can see in this chart, we've got 2 data points that were above the upper limits. That would kind of lead to the question of what was different. And as the manager of this webinar series, clearly I haven't figured out how to recreate the magic of those 2 webinars that really had high registration. So with that, let me hand things back over to Adam and Ryan to take a look within the software platform, and they're going to demonstrate some things, and I'll chime in as needed, or I guess I'll just chime in when I want to.
Perfect. We appreciate that, Mark. Thank you so much for the background and your expertise and setting us up to kind of show how we can, in fact, visualize this information in KaiNexus using control charts. So I'm going to go ahead and jump out of our slide deck here. We're going to go head over to KaiNexus. Probably going to make me log back in here. And the first thing I want to do, Mark, is we've actually built out that webinar registrations chart that you alluded to. And so I'd like us to kind of start with the finished product of what that looks like in the system, and then we'll kind of take it from there. So I'm going to do a quick search in the system here for webinar. Should bring up our chart based on that relevant keyword search. So here's our webinar registrations that Mark was showing in the slide deck here. So Mark, looks like you've been tracking this for quite a while, and this is mimicking exactly what we saw on the slides there.
Yes.
This is kind of our final chart here that's been tracked over time. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to walk everyone through on the line of how can we start by creating a brand new control chart in KaiNexus. So I mentioned that control chart functionality has always been available in KaiNexus. For some of our power users who are familiar with working on those, setting up control charts used to be done back in the options of the chart, where there would be some options in here to add the upper, the average, the lower limits, start to set some notifications based on data points within those limits. And so what we've done now, if we come back to our main dashboard, is we've brought control charts to the forefront. And so in KaiNexus, there used to be just 4 chart types that you could create from the get-go. If you were to go to the create dropdown and we're working with charts, we've always had our bar line, we had our bowling, we had our Pareto. Threshold has been something that's been around for a couple of years now. And now you'll see that there's going to be the ability to create a control chart here. And so I'll go ahead, I'll select control. We are going to start out by giving a title. So we'll stick with the same topic that we're talking about here. We'll go with our webinar registrations. And for the purposes of time, I think we'll focus on, Mark, from your data set. We'll just look at the numbers for 2019. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, because there's 12 data points. We do 1 webinar a month generally, and 12 data points is enough to get started with valid control limit calculations. Yeah.
Perfect. So everything else here is optional on our chart. We'll just go ahead and create this so we can dive right in and get some data into the system. So When you're working with charts, really in KaiNexus, the way that we help coach you is to follow the blue. So you'll notice right now, clearly we don't see a chart. And in order to do that, we're going to need to get some data into the system, right? So you'll see the little blue button there for add data. We'll go over and click on that. This is going to bring us into that screen that I showed previously with the built out control chart. And with us focusing specifically on a control chart here, if we stick with that motto of follow the blue, you'll see that the first thing we want to do is go ahead and set up our control limits. So in that case, we'll go ahead and add our control limits. You can start off by naming those control limits. I'll just keep it pretty generic here and call it control limits. We can include a description. We'll just add a little hover over text if you were to hover over those control limits, giving you a little bit more context. And then as we can see here, Mark, we have our upper control limit, the average, as well as our lower control limit that we can start to put some appearance and things of that nature around. We do have tooltips everywhere to just kind of help everybody understand what these mean. Mark, can you talk a little bit about when you're setting up the upper control, lower control, average, where those numbers are coming from specifically?
Yeah, so those numbers always come from, a baseline time frame. So here, if we've got just 12 data points, we'll use all 12 data points. And again, like I said earlier, even though I'm partial to using the XMR chart format for the charts, and that does drive the way the limits are calculated. Sometimes people are going to use other forms of control charts, and that's their preference. So we don't dictate how those what method is used, but using the XMR chart functionality, I went ahead earlier and calculated outside of KaiNexus what those three numbers are.
Perfect. So right now we're going to start with the visualization, right? We have our upper control limit. We can title this if we want to call it something other than upper control limit. Right now, Mark, the way that we set it up is the default color of any data points that would be above or below the control limit we set. We're going to have those visualized in orange. We wanted to go with a neutral color here, depending on how you're using control charts. Sometimes you may be aiming to increase that metric, decrease. Sometimes you might be just wanting to stay within those limits. Any more color that you want to add on there?
Quite literally, right? We can add. Let's see what you did there, Adam. Yeah, so I set up in the control chart for webinar registration. I actually configured it so anything above the upper limit is green, and anything below the lower limit would be red. Now, those showed as blue. This might be jumping ahead, but those data points showed as blue on my chart because I also added annotations.
Correct. Yeah, that's we're looking at even enhancing that annotation experience, Mark, where we're going to kind of put the border of the data point would be blue so that you can recognize the annotation while also still keeping true to the colors that you set up for those data points.
Yeah, that's great because I would just real quick, I'd add an annotation. The two presenters for those webinars above the upper limit, we're really grateful to them. It was Jess Orr and Ritu Ward. So I guess we need to invite them back to do more webinars.
Yeah, sounds good. And I'll give everybody, if we have some time, a little insight into setting up those annotations. But sticking with what Mark mentioned there, in this case with webinar registrations, it's a metric that we would like to see increasing over time. So I'll go ahead and make the data points green, red when they're below. We can go further with the appearance and set the line color of our control limits. So I think black should be fine here, dash. I think with the average, Mark, I'll make this one dash like you did. Maybe just use a different color here for that. We'll make that a dash line. So now we've got our upper limit, average, lower limit from an appearance standpoint of what those are going to look like on our chart. And then the next thing, Mark, down here that you talked about is all around those rules. So the three rules by default, these are all selected, and this is going to help with sending notifications in KaiNexus. You want to talk a little bit more about the rules, Mark, or?
Yeah, so I mean, like what I was taught about control charts, rule 1 is the most definitive. Rule 2 is very helpful and pretty definitive. There's variation. It's different textbooks and different approaches. Sometimes people are taught you're looking for 6 or 7 or 8, or even some textbooks say 9. You're like, how do the statisticians disagree? But long story short, we've built in that flexibility. If somebody within the context of, let's say, their Six Sigma or Lean Six Sigma program has taught you looking for 7, you can configure it that way.
Right.
You can click and change that number. And then rule 3, some people may choose not to use rule 3, and there are in some textbooks additional rules that you can add, but what I was taught is that there's diminishing returns to adding those rules. So we're trying to keep it simple, and we think it's a good, valid approach to recommend these 3 rules to our customers.
Yeah, and so again, I'll mention that these will be selected by default. To Mark's point, if you're wanting to just receive notifications about rule 1 and rule 2, you can go ahead and deselect rule 3. We have 8 as the default number of data points for rule 2, but of course, based on how you're using the charts, you can change that as well. The thing is that rule 1 was always an option on the previous version of controlled charts in KaiNexus, and so now we have the ability to have notifications generate based on rule 2 and rule 3, as you talked about.
Yeah, and real quickly, rule 1 shows if there's basically like an extreme outlier, a very unexpected single data point that's worth reacting to. Rule 2 helps us see if performance has shifted in maybe a less dramatic way, but what appears to be a sustained way. And that could be because of changes we're intentionally making to try to improve the system, or sometimes it's just occurring, and it's good to have the control chart flag and notify us of that. This is one good thing that KaiNexus can automate in the process of telling us, hey, here's the chart you should look at right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've kept those notifications in the system, Mark, to be very generic in terms of these 3 rules, because, for example, getting a notification for rule 1, you want to do the investigation to determine if that is in fact an outlier, if that is a signal that requires us to make some changes. So we've decided to not automate those, but put it on the user to really look at the data and understand what the appropriate next step is.
Well said.
Thank you.
The professor can leave. The TA can handle this, I think.
The student has become the master. So let's go ahead. If I was to go ahead and save this right now, we would be able to visualize our control limits. But what I want to do is I'm going to save and add data series, because what we want is we want to associate what the registrations are to this control limit, right? So if I save and add data series here, this will pull up an add data series where we'll actually title this the registration numbers. So we'll do registrations, description. We can do this as a line graph. It's already being associated with that control limits for us, so we don't have to worry about setting up anything there. We can come in here and do an appearance for our line. In this case, let's get some more color on our chart. I love having the show markers here. And then we can go ahead and save this now. So we've really built out the framework now for us to come into KaiNexus and populate our data. The first thing that I want to do is I'm going to start by adding some rows in here. So rather than do this one at a time, I'm going to go ahead and build multi-rows. I'll start with, I know the dates won't be 100%, Mark, but we'll do January of 2019, and then we'll have that go through December of 2019.
Yeah, but for people who are tracking monthly metrics, this is a really nice enhancement to the system.
So we'll go ahead and build those rows for us, right? We'll have January through December. Now, if we know, of course, the webinar might not have been on December 1st, so you can come in here and edit that. But I want to come in here and actually put in what those registration numbers are. So referring to my doc here, this is going to be 288, got 245. Oh, you know what? I spoiled something, Mark. I want to remove those. There's another feature functionality. So let's do the first one here. So based on the registrations that we'll have is when you'll be able to determine your upper, average, and lower. And so I am going to put in those numbers just to start off here because I want to show some functionality of how these will continue to update for you as you add in new rows in the system.
Okay.
So for example, the reason that I wanted to put these in first is if you had for your chart, for example, Mark, where you're continuing to track that time over time, when you do add a new row for that next month, what it's going to do is you'll see it automatically brings your upper, average, and lower from the preceding month. And if you need to make changes, you can absolutely do that. One of the things that was a little cumbersome in the system was that the upper, average, and lower would change when you change that across all of time. And so now it won't do that anymore. So you will be able to visually see that shift if you were to make changes to that upper, average, and lower limit.
Yeah, well, and let me just comment. I think it's good practice to not continually recalculate control limits, that they should continue propagating forward unless we see a signal that's indicative of a real shift in performance.
Yep. So now that I've put in the upper, average, and lower, I'm going to come in here and get those other months for us so that it'll automatically add those in. So let's do monthly here. Beautiful, all of our upper, average, and lower. So now I'll just come in and calculate these registrations again. So we have 245, 220, 180, 363, 259, 325, 288.
The number got worse. Oh no. The number got better. Hooray. Oh, it went down again. See, these are the emotion swings that an organization sometimes goes through. Oh, the number dropped. Explain why. Okay.
All right. So now we've got everything built out here. We have January through December of 2019. We have our upper, average, and lower, of course. The registration numbers are in there. So let's actually take a look at our control chart now here in KaiNexus.
And in fact, I think I'm going to go back and modify my control chart to add those markers, those dots that occur for each data point, because I think that just helps.
Yeah, one of the things I think we did, Mark, is in that last release is we have that now checked by default because we agree that it's a much better visualization. And of course, the other thing I can show here is Mark mentioned earlier that if you wanted to come in and make note of, for example, this data point here in November, you can add annotations to KaiNexus by simply clicking on the data point and then going ahead and add an annotation, which can be a note if you just want to make a note, like you said, of who that speaker was, or with the concept of continuous improvement, maybe there was a change, maybe there was an idea that was implemented in the organization that led to that shift in the numbers, in which case you could come in and attribute that idea in the system to the data point as well.
Yeah, because maybe we changed the way we marketed and promoted the webinars.
The one other thing I did want to point out, Mark, is you will receive those types of notifications in the system, but another way that you can help visualize charts that may or may not be in control or out of control is if we jump over to the list area here in KaiNexus, what we can do is, let's, for example, take a look at, put this in the list view, and let's just get some charts here. So I just wanted to look specifically at the chart workflow. Of course, I can go ahead and filter down that way. And then one of the things that we can do is you can then filter, and there'll be some chart options in here for chart state, where you'll be able to go ahead and filter down to see any of those charts that are in control or out of control. So this would be a good way to, you'll get that notification. You can have a card set up like this on a board or a saved list that you have and easily be able to visualize all of those charts, jump in, take a look at that data, and make the appropriate decision in terms of what next steps may or may not be.
Yeah.
That is that's everything I had from a demo perspective. If there are any questions, Mark, I want to let you know, I don't know if you saw this, but that somebody did make a comment that Graban dude is the man, so wanted to give you a shout out there. At this point, if there are any questions, please feel free to type those in the chat box. I'm going to let Adam jump back in though.
Yeah, I mean, if there are no further questions, we really want to thank everyone for your time today. Of course, we hope these webinars are valuable, and we certainly appreciate the feedback on these. To check out any of our past webinars, head over to kainexus.com/webinars/office-hours. And be sure to sign up for our next training team office hours, which will be held in February. If you do have any questions or need assistance with configuration of the features you saw here today, please reach out to your KaiNexus customer experience lead. In the meantime, we encourage you to check out our support page at support.kainexus.com. And thanks again for your time today, Mark. Always a pleasure.
Yes, thank you, Mark.
Thanks, guys. Adam, welcome to the Office Hours team, and thanks for letting me be a guest.
Thank you very much.
You see what happens when we get Banna out of here, Mark? We got guest appearances now. This is feeling legit.
Well, with all that being said, exactly. With all that being said, I'm Adam Darnell. He's Ryan Rippey.
Thanks for tuning in.
And we'll see you next time.